The smell hit you before anything else. A quarter-mile from Ragnhild Ketilsdottir's farm, walking into the wind off the Vestfjord, you could smell it. A thick, sour, living smell that coated the inside of your nostrils and stayed there for hours afterward. The kind of smell that made grown men cover their faces with their sleeves and children run back the way they came. "She is rotting fish," Jarl Eirik Haraldsson said to his wife one evening in the great hall at Havenfjord, his face twisted in the particular disgust of a man who believed himself too important to tolerate bad smells. 40 barrels of good cod left to putrefy in pits. The woman has lost her mind. "Maybe she knows something we do not," his wife Inga offered carefully. "She knows nothing. She is a fishwife who married above her station, and now that Ketil is dead, she has reverted to the habits of her people. Coastal peasants who eat rotten fish because they are too lazy or too stupid to smoke it properly." Jarl Eirik pushed his plate away and drank deeply from his ale cup. He had been the most powerful man on the Vestfjord for 11 years, a position he maintained not through violence or cunning, but through the simple accumulation of surplus. He had more grain, more dried fish, more salted meat, more firewood, more of everything than any man within 2 days' ride. This surplus gave him leverage. When the bad years came, and they always came, people needed what Eirik had, and they paid for it with land, with labor, with loyalty. That was the system. That was how power worked on the Vestfjord. And Eirik did not appreciate anyone who threatened the system by having surplus of their own. Ragnhild Ketilsdottir was threatening the system. She just was not doing it in any way that Eirik could understand. She had arrived on the Vestfjord 19 years ago as the young wife of Ketil Thorvaldsson, a quiet, methodical fisherman who had built a solid farm on the north shore of the fjord. Ketil was respected, but not powerful, a man who kept to himself, paid his taxes on time, and never caused trouble. He and Ragnhild had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, and they lived the kind of unremarkable, steady life that does not attract attention or envy. Ketil had drowned 2 winters ago. His boat had gone over in a squall on the outer fjord, the kind of sudden, vicious storm that takes good sailors and bad alike. They found the boat upside down on the rocks near Skarvanes. They never found Ketil. Ragnhild had not wept where anyone could see her. She had come to the thing that spring, stood before the assembly, and stated in a clear, flat voice that she would be keeping the farm, keeping the fishing rights, and keeping all of her husband's property. There had been murmurs. A widow keeping a farm was not unheard of, but it was unusual, and several men had already been calculating what pieces of Ketil's estate they might acquire. "The farm is mine," Ragnhild had said. "I will work it. I will pay my taxes. If any man disputes this, let him say so now." No one had said so. Ragnhild was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that does not invite argument, and her eldest son, Torsten, was 16 and already nearly as tall as his father had been. The matter was settled. What happened next was what confused everyone. If you have been watching Saga of Survival for a while, you know that the people who endure are never the ones who do what everyone expects. They are the ones who understand something that the comfortable and the powerful have forgotten. And what Ragnhild understood was this: the biggest killer on the Vestfjord was not cold. It was not storms. It was not raiders or disease. The biggest killer was the gap between April and June, those 8 to 10 weeks after the winter stores ran out and before the spring fish returned to the fjord. That gap killed more people than any blizzard ever had. Every year, the same pattern. Families would smoke their fish, salt their meat, dry their grain, and calculate their stores with the confidence of people who had survived winters before. And every year, in the same way, the stores would run short somewhere around March. The salted fish would run low. The dried meat would be gone. The grain would be measured in handfuls rather than bushels. And families would start making the desperate calculations that starving people make. How many days until the fish return? Can we kill the goat and still have milk in summer? Who eats less today so that someone eats at all tomorrow? Jarl profited from this gap. Every spring, he sold his surplus at prices that would have been considered robbery in any other season. A bushel of grain that cost 2 silver coins in autumn cost 8 in April. Dried fish that traded freely in December commanded a king's price in March. It was not kindness. It was not charity. It was the cold mathematics of a man who had more when everyone else had less. Ragnhild intended to break that mathematics, and the tool she would use was 40 barrels of rotting fish. The knowledge had come from her grandmother, a woman named Bergliot, who had grown up on the far northern coast, beyond the Arctic Circle, in a place where winter lasted 9 months, and the gap between stores and spring was not weeks, but months. Bergliot's people had survived that gap for generations using a technique that no one on the Vestfjord practiced, a technique so counterintuitive that explaining it to people who had never seen it was nearly impossible. They buried their fish, not smoked fish, not salted fish, not dried fish, raw fish, gutted and cleaned, but otherwise untreated, packed into wooden barrels and buried in pits below the frost line, left to ferment slowly in the cold earth for months. The process was called pressing, and the result was hakarl, a fermented fish that smelled like death and lasted forever. Ragnhild's grandmother had taught her the technique when she was 12 years old, standing beside a pit on the northern coast, the old woman's hands steady and sure as she packed the fish into the barrels with the precision of someone performing a sacred act. The smell is the preservation, Bergliot had told her. When the fish smells that way, nothing else will eat it. Not rats, not foxes, not mold, not rot. The fermentation kills everything except the nutrition. The fish will keep for 2 years underground, 3 if you bury it deep enough. But who would eat it? Ragnhild had asked, her nose wrinkled, her eyes watering. Everyone. When March comes and the smokehouse is empty and the salt barrels are dry and the children cry at night because their bellies are eating themselves, everyone will eat it, and they will thank the gods for every bite. Ragnhild had remembered those words for 19 years. She had thought of them every spring when the stores ran low and Ketil's face grew tight with the worry that all providers carry in the hungry weeks. She had thought of them every time she saw families lined up outside Jarl Eirik's storehouse, trading their last silver for a week's worth of grain that should have cost a fraction of what Eirik charged. Now Ketil was gone, the farm was hers, and Ragnhild was going to prove her grandmother right. She started in August, the peak of the cod run, in when the fjord was thick with fish and her boat came back heavy every morning. Most families smoked their catch immediately, hanging the split cod on wooden racks where the wind and salt air would cure them over weeks. Ragnhild smoked some of hers too, She was not a fool, and she needed food for the immediate winter. But for every fish she hung on the smoking racks, she set 3 aside. These she gutted, cleaned, and packed into oak barrels that she had been building since June. She packed them tight, alternating layers of fish with layers of coarse sea salt and dried seaweed, pressing each layer down with a wooden disc weighted with stones. When each barrel was full, she sealed the top with pine pitch, carried it to the pit she had dug behind the farm, and buried it 4 feet below the surface. She buried 5 barrels the first week, then 7 the next. By the end of September, she had 40 barrels underground, each containing roughly 12 pounds of packed fish, 500 pounds total. A fortune in protein, sealed underground, fermenting slowly in the constant cold of the deep earth. And the smell had started. It was faint at first, in early October, a sweetish sour note on the wind that you might mistake for marsh gas or a dead animal somewhere in the undergrowth. By November, it was unmistakable. The fermentation was working, the bacteria in the fish producing the acids that would preserve it, and the gases rising through the packed earth above carried the smell upward like smoke from a fire. The village of Havenfjord talked about nothing else for weeks. "She is wasting good fish," said Gunnar Oxback, a farmer who owned the land adjacent to Ragnhild's. "I can smell it from my barn. My horses are restless. My wife cannot hang laundry. The woman is burying food and letting it rot." "She should be stopped," said Torkel the Fat, who owned the smokehouse where most families paid to cure their fish. "Burying fish is not preservation. It is waste, and the smell is driving people away from the shore." Jarl Eirik said nothing publicly, but he sent his steward, Halvor, to visit Ragnhild's farm on the pretense of inspecting the property line between her land and Gunnar's. Halvor came back, looking uncomfortable. "She has 40 barrels underground," he told Eric, "buried in a pit behind the cowshed. The pit is lined with stones and covered with planks and turf. She has weighted the top with rocks. The smell is extraordinary. Is it rotting? She says it is fermenting. She says it is an old technique from the north. She says the fish will be edible in 4 months. Edible, Eric repeated, as if the word itself were offensive. In 4 months. So she believes she can bury raw fish in the ground in September and eat it in January. She believes it will last much longer than that. She says it will be good through April, through May, through the summer, if needed. Eric shook his head slowly. The woman is deluded. The fish will rot. The barrels will leak. Rats will find it. By January, she will have 40 barrels of poisonous slime underground and no stores to replace them. And then she will come to me, as they all do, and she will pay my price for grain. He was wrong about every single thing, but he would not know that for months. And in those months, Ragnhild would do something that no one on the Vestfjord had done in living memory. She would take the gap, those terrible weeks between empty stores and returning fish, and she would close it, not with silver, not with borrowed grain, not with the desperate trades that kept men like Eirik wealthy and everyone else poor. She would close it with patience and bacteria and 40 barrels of fish that smelled like the end of the world. The first test came in November. Ragnhild opened 1 barrel to check the progress, digging down through the frozen topsoil to the wooden lid, prying it up with a flat iron bar. The smell that rose from the barrel was staggering. Her eldest son, Torsten, standing 3 feet away, turned his head and gagged. Her daughter, Sigrid, retreated to the barn door and would not come closer. But Ragnhild leaned in and studied the fish with the focus of a craftsman inspecting her work. The flesh had changed color from the pink of fresh cod to a pale amber, the first sign of proper fermentation. The texture was firmer than it had been in September, holding its shape when she pressed it with her thumb rather than flaking apart. The liquid in the bottom of the barrel was clear, not cloudy, which meant the salt ratio was correct and the breakdown was proceeding along the right path. She cut a small piece and tasted it. The flavor was still raw, still too sharp, still months away from the mellow intensity that her grandmother had described. But the foundation was there. The acids were building. The transformation was underway. 2 more months, she told Torsten. By January, it will be ready. Ready for what? Torsten asked. He trusted his mother completely, but even complete trust has its limits when the subject is buried fish that smells like something died beneath the cowshed. Ready to save every person on this fjord, you will see. She resealed the barrel, repacked the earth and turf above it, and went inside to feed the fire. Outside, the first flakes of what would become the longest winter in Vestfjord memory were beginning to fall. The second thing Ragnhild did that November was something no one noticed. She began counting. Not her own stores. She knew those to the pound. She began counting everyone else's. She walked the village under the pretense of visiting, of trading small talk, of checking on neighbors the way women did when the days grew short and the dark came early. But while she talked, she looked. She counted the fish on the smoking racks. She estimated the barrels in the salt houses. She noted the size of the wood piles and the condition of the livestock and the number of mouths in each household. The numbers were not good. Most families had stored enough for a standard winter. 5 months of deep cold, thaw in March, fishing by April. None of them had stored enough for what was coming. None of them could have, because none of them knew what was coming. Only Ragnhild, who had listened to her grandmother's stories about the long winters above the Arctic Circle, understood that the standard calculations were based on averages, and averages are meaningless when the exception arrives. She made a list. 26 families in and around Havenfjord. 312 people. At minimum subsistence, the bare amount needed to keep a body alive and functional, those people would need roughly 40 pounds of preserved food per day. For each week beyond the expected thaw, the village would need 280 pounds that did not exist in any storehouse, on any smoking rack, in any barrel above ground. Ragnhild's 40 barrels held 500 pounds, enough for 18 days of village-wide emergency feeding. It was not much, but it was infinitely more than nothing, which was what everyone else had. The winter came early that year, as it did on the Vestfjord, roughly 1 year in 5. The first snow fell in the last week of October, a full month ahead of the usual schedule, and by mid-November, the fjord was sheeted with ice from shore to shore. This was not the slow, grudging freeze of a normal winter, where the ice crept outward from the shallows over weeks. This was sudden and total, the kind of freeze that catches boats at anchor and seals the fish below the surface and cuts off the coastal settlements from the open sea as completely as a stone wall. Now, before we get into the worst of it, if you have been watching Saga of Survival and these stories of ingenuity and quiet preparation speak to you, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. It costs nothing, and it helps us keep making these. Stay with me because what Ragnhild's grandmother taught her is the reason an entire village survived what comes next. The early freeze meant the autumn fishing season was cut short by 3 weeks. 3 weeks of lost catches. 3 weeks of fish that should have been on smoking racks and in salt barrels, but instead were swimming under 2 inches of ice, unreachable. Every family on the Vestfjord had calculated their winter stores based on fishing through the end of November. The ice changed that calculation overnight. By December, the conversations in the village had shifted from annoyance about Ragnhild's smell to worry about food. The smoked fish supply that should have lasted until March would now run out in February. The dried meat that was supposed to bridge the gap was being eaten faster than planned. Grain was being rationed earlier than it should have been, and the cold kept coming. January brought the worst storms anyone could remember. 3 blizzards in 2 weeks, each one lasting 3 or 4 days. The wind screaming off the frozen fjord at speeds that tore the turf from rooftops and buried fence posts under 6 feet of drift. Livestock died in the fields. Barns collapsed under snow weight. The path between farmsteads, normally a 20-minute walk, became a 2-hour ordeal through waist-deep drifts. By the end of January, the first deaths occurred. Old Jarl, who lived alone on the eastern shore, was found frozen in his bed. His smokehouse was empty. His grain bin held 2 handfuls of barley. He had been too proud to ask for help, and no one had checked on him in the storm. 2 children died in the settlement below Eric's hall. Not from cold, their parents' home was sound enough, but from a wasting sickness that came from eating too little for too long. Their bodies could not fight the fever because their bodies had nothing left to fight with. Eric opened his storehouse in February, as he always did. The prices were higher than anyone had ever seen. A bushel of grain cost 12 silver coins. Dried fish commanded 6 coins per pound. Families who had no silver traded labor. A month's work in Eirik's fields comes spring for a week's worth of food now. Some traded land. 2 families signed over their fishing rights entirely, rights their grandparents had held, rights that had sustained them for generations, traded away for enough food to survive until March. Ragnhild did not visit the storehouse. She did not trade silver or labor or land. She stayed on her farm with her 3 children, and every morning smoke rose from her chimney, and her children looked fed, and her livestock were alive, and her path was cleared, and her fences were standing. Gunnar Oxback, her neighbor, was the first to crack. He appeared at her door on a February morning, his face gaunt, his clothing hanging loose on a frame that had been thick with muscle 6 months ago. His wife stood behind him, holding their youngest child, a girl of 3 who was not crying because she had learned that crying did not make food appear. "Ragnhild," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that I am not asking lightly. You are hungry. We are starving. The last of our fish was gone a week ago. I cannot pay Eirik's prices. I have nothing left to trade." Ragnhild looked at him for a long moment. This was the man who had complained about her smell, who had called her methods wasteful, who had said, in the hearing of the village, that burying fish was the stupidity of a woman who did not know any better. "Come inside," she said. She took him to the pit behind the cowshed. The snow was knee-deep, and Ragnhild had to kick through the drifts to clear a path. Torsten followed with a shovel, scraping the packed ice from the wooden planks that covered the pit. When the last plank came up and the turf was pulled aside, the smell that rose from the earth was extraordinary, pungent, sharp, alien, the concentrated essence of 5 months of slow bacterial transformation. Gunnar took a step back, His wife covered her face. Even Torsten, who had grown up with the smell his entire life, turned his head for a moment before leaning back in. The pit was 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, lined with flat stones that Ragnhild and Kettle had hauled from the shore 7 years ago, back when the pit had been theoretical, back when Ragnhild had described the technique to her husband, and he had said, "If your grandmother says it works, we build it." The barrels stood in rows, 3 across and multiple deep, their oak staves dark with moisture, their iron hoops dusted with the white crystalline residue of the fermentation gases. Ragnhild climbed down into the pit using the stone steps she had carved into the side wall, and pried the lid from one of the barrels with an iron bar. Inside, the fish had transformed. The flesh was yellowish white, firm, with a texture somewhere between cheese and cured meat. It did not look rotted, it looked changed, preserved by a process that was older than any technique Gunnar had ever seen. She held the open barrel toward the lantern light so Gunnar could see. The fish was solid, compact, holding its shape perfectly. No slime, no discoloration, no mold, just the dense, amber-tinged flesh of cod that had been slowly broken down and rebuilt by bacteria in the cold earth. Its proteins transformed into something more concentrated, more nutritious, and far more durable than any smoked or salted fish that anyone on the Vestfjord had ever seen. "Eat this," Ragnhild said, cutting a piece with her knife and holding it out. Gunnar looked at the fish. He looked at his wife. He looked at his daughter. He ate. The taste hit him like a slap, sharp, intensely savory, with a sourness that prickled the back of his throat and a depth of flavor that was almost overwhelming. It was not what he expected. He had expected the taste of rot, of decay, of something that had gone wrong. Instead, he tasted something that had been carefully and deliberately transformed into something new, something that was dense with nutrition and alive with the particular energy that fermented foods carry. "More," he said. Ragnhild gave him a full portion, enough for a meal. She gave his wife the same and cut a smaller piece for the child. She wrapped enough for 2 more days in birch bark and handed it to him. "Come back when you need more," she said. "Tell no one where it came from, not yet." But Gunnar told his brother, and his brother told the blacksmith, and the blacksmith told the tanner. And within a week, Ragnhild's secret was no longer a secret. It was the only topic of conversation in Havenfjord. If Saga of Survival has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Your support helps us bring you more stories of Norse ingenuity and quiet vindication. By the first week of March, Ragnhild was feeding 14 families. She had opened 6 barrels, each one providing enough food for a dozen people for 3 days. The fish was rich, dense, calorie-heavy. A small portion could sustain a grown man through a day of labor. It was not pleasant to eat, not by the standards of people who were accustomed to smoked cod and fresh bread. But it was food, real food, at a time when the alternative was starvation or debt to a man who charged 12 coins for grain worth 2. The routine established itself quickly. Every 3rd day, Ragnhild opened a barrel, and the women of the families she was feeding came to her farm to collect their portions. They came at dawn, before the men were awake in most cases, because there was still shame attached to needing help, still a sense among the proud Norse families of the Vestfjord that accepting food from a widow's charity was a failure that reflected on the entire household. Ragnhild understood this, and she handled it with the particular tact of a woman who had been dismissed often enough to know that dignity costs nothing to give and everything to take away. She did not distribute the food as charity. She distributed it as teaching. Each woman who came to her farm learned something: how the fish had been packed, what the salt ratio was, how to check the color and texture for proper fermentation. She turned the feeding into a class, and the class into a community, and the community into something that would outlast the winter by decades. Torkel the Fat, who owned the smokehouse, was the last to come. He had held out longer than anyone, partly out of pride and partly because his smokehouse had given him a slight advantage. He had eaten his own inventory, the fish that customers had paid to cure but had not yet collected. That supply lasted him through February. But by March, the smokehouse was truly empty, and Torkel stood at Ragnhild's door looking like a man who had swallowed something bitter. "Before you say anything," Ragnhild told him, "I am not interested in an apology. I am interested in whether you can build barrels. I need 6 more for next year, and your smokehouse has the tools." Torkel stared at her. Then he nodded. And that was the end of the conflict between them, settled not by argument or apology, but by the simple recognition that skills are more valuable than pride. The March thaw did not come. That was when things went from bad to desperate. Normally, by mid-March, the first signs of spring appeared on the Vestfjord. The ice would thin, the days would lengthen, the earliest fish would return to the shallows. But this year, the cold held. The ice stayed solid. The fjord remained sealed. And the spring that everyone had been counting on, the spring that was supposed to end the hunger and refill the empty storehouses, simply did not arrive. April came, and the ice was still there. Thick, dense, unbroken ice, miles of it, sealing the fjord from shore to shore like a lid on a coffin. The fish could not get in. The boats could not get out. The coastal economy that sustained every family on the Vestfjord was suspended, frozen, held in a state of permanent winter that no one had prepared for, because no one had imagined it could last this long. No one except Ragnhild. Her grandmother had told her about winters like this. 8-month winters, 9-month winters, winters where the ice came in October and did not leave until June. They were rare but not unknown in the far north, and Bergliot's people had learned that the difference between survival and death in those winters was not how much food you stored, but how long your food could last. Smoked fish lasted 4 months. Salted fish lasted 5, maybe 6 in a good cellar. Dried grain lasted longer, but lacked the calories and nutrients that a body needed to survive hard labor in deep cold. Only fermented fish, buried deep, packed tight, left to transform in the constant cold of the earth, could last 8 months, 9 months, a year or more, and still provide real sustenance when it was pulled from the ground. Ragnhild had planned for 8 months. She had calculated 40 barrels based on her grandmother's formula. 1 barrel per person per month for the emergency period. She had planned for her family of 4, plus a margin of 10 extra people. That margin was now feeding the village, and the math was getting tight. She opened the barrels carefully, one at a time, rationing each one to last as long as possible. She showed the women of the village how to prepare the fish, slicing it thin, letting it air for an hour to reduce the strongest flavors, mixing it with whatever grain or root vegetables remained to stretch each portion. She taught them how to recognize bad barrels, the rare ones where the fermentation had failed and the fish had truly rotted rather than transformed. She taught them to trust the process even when every instinct said the smell meant danger. If you are still here, hit that subscribe button right now. It is free, takes a second, and what happens next will change everything you think you know about food preservation. The crisis came in late April. 22 families were now dependent on Ragnhild's supply. She had 12 barrels left. At the current rate of consumption, they would last 3 weeks. The ice showed no sign of breaking. Ragnhild sat in her farmhouse that night after the children were asleep and did the mathematics one more time. 12 barrels. Approximately 144 pounds of preserved fish. 22 families, roughly 130 people. At minimum rations, the bare amount to keep bodies alive, she could stretch it to perhaps 25 days. But minimum rations meant people who could not work, could not clear snow from their roofs, could not haul water from the wells that had to be chopped open every morning. Minimum rations meant a village that was surviving but not functioning, and a village that could not function in a Vestfjord winter was a village that was dying slowly instead of quickly. She decided on a middle path, enough to sustain work, not enough to feel full. She would cut each family's daily portion by a third and hope that the ice broke before the barrels ran out. The hardest part was watching the children. Adults understood rationing. Adults could feel the hunger and know intellectually that it was temporary, that the ice would break eventually, that spring had to come because it always came. Children did not understand that. Children understood only that they were hungry and that the food was not enough, and their faces, thin, serious, aged beyond their years, were the thing that kept Ragnhild awake at night, staring at the roof beams, doing the same calculation over and over and getting the same answer every time. It is enough, barely, if nothing goes wrong, if the ice breaks by mid-May, if no one gets sick, if something did go wrong. On the 2nd of May, one of the remaining barrels turned out to be bad. Ragnhild opened it and knew immediately. The smell was different, not the sharp, clean sourness of successful fermentation, but a wet, a foul sweetness that meant the salt ratio had been wrong, or a crack in the wood had admitted water. The fish inside was dark, slimy, unmistakably rotted rather than fermented. 12 pounds of food, gone. 1 barrel out of 11 remaining. She did not tell anyone. She buried the spoiled fish in the frozen ground behind the pit, rinsed the barrel, and went back to her calculations. 11 barrels, 132 pounds, 18 days at the revised rations. The ice had to break by the 20th of May, or they would run out entirely. Eirik's storehouse was empty. He had sold everything, and the wealth he had accumulated, the silver, the labor pledges, the fishing rights, the land deeds, sat in his strongbox like artifacts from a world that no longer existed. You cannot eat silver. You cannot warm yourself with a land deed. And when the man who has always had more than everyone else suddenly has nothing, the power structure that kept him on top dissolves like ice in a warm current. Eirik came to Ragnhild on the 23rd of April. He came alone, without his steward, without his guards, without any of the trappings of authority that he normally wore like armor. He came as a man who was hungry, whose wife was hungry, whose household was hungry, and who had finally run out of everything except pride. And pride, as Bergljot had once told Ragnhild, is not food. I have come to buy fish, Eirik said. I do not sell fish, Ragnhild replied. I give it. Eirik stared at her. The concept was so foreign to his way of thinking that it took him a full 10 seconds to process the words. You give it. I give it to anyone who needs it. I have given it to Gunnar, and his family. I have given it to the blacksmith and the tanner and the families below your hall. I will give it to you. I do not accept charity. Then call it something else. Call it a trade. I give you fish. You give me nothing. When the ice breaks and the world returns to normal, we are even. Eric's jaw worked. Every instinct in his body rebelled against accepting something for nothing from a woman he had dismissed as a fool 6 months ago. But his stomach was empty, and his wife's face was thin, and the children in his household looked at him with the dull, unfocused eyes of people who have been hungry for too long. He accepted. Ragnhild gave him 3 pounds of hakarl, enough for his household for 2 days. She gave it to him without ceremony, without triumph, without any of the satisfaction that a lesser person might have felt at seeing the most powerful man on the Vestfjord standing in her yard with his hand out. "Come back when you need more," she said. The same words she had said to Gunnar, the same flat, steady tone, the same absence of judgment. The ice broke on the 11th of May. Ragnhild heard it before she saw it. She was standing in the yard at dawn, feeding the goats, 2 animals that had survived the winter on stored hay and pure stubbornness, when a sound came from the fjord. A deep, groaning crack, like the earth splitting open, followed by a series of smaller pops and snaps that ran across the frozen surface like a chain of distant gunfire. She walked to the bluff above the shore and looked out. The first cracks appeared, running across the surface like veins on a leaf. Dark water showed through the gaps, alive and moving for the first time in 7 months. The tidal pressure underneath the ice did the rest, lifting and dropping the sheets, widening the cracks, breaking the solid surface into fragments that rocked and tilted against each other. By midday, the open water was visible in patches. By evening, the fragments were drifting apart. By the following morning, the channel from the outer sea to the inner fjord was clear enough for a small boat. On the 3rd day, the fjord was open. The fish were running. And the boats that had been hauled up on shore since October, their hulls scraped and recalked by men with nothing else to do during the dark months, were back in the water. The first catch came in that afternoon, carried up to the village by men who wept openly at the weight of the nets, because weight meant food, and food meant the dying was over. The 8-month winter was over. 243 days from the first freeze to the first thaw. The longest unbroken winter in the memory of anyone living on the Vestfjord. Ragnhild had used 34 of her 40 barrels. She had 6 remaining, enough to last her family through another 2 months if needed. But it was not needed. The spring came in force, the fish ran thick, and within 2 weeks the immediate crisis was past. The color returned to children's faces. The men straightened from the hunched posture of hunger. The women stopped counting portions and started cooking them, and the sound of laughter returned to the settlement like a bird that had been missing since October. What remained was the accounting. Jarl Erik called a thing in late May, the first assembly since the autumn before the freeze. Every family on the Vestfjord attended. The hall was full, the benches packed, the air thick with the particular energy of people who have survived something terrible together and need to understand what it means. Eirik stood before the assembly. He was thinner than he had been. The winter had taken weight from him as it had from everyone. But the real change was in his face. The confident, calculating expression that had defined him for 11 years was gone, replaced by something more complicated, something that looked like the beginning of humility. "This winter was the worst in memory," he said. "We lost 9 people. We would have lost many more. The reason we did not lose more is Ragnhild Ketilsdottir." He paused. The hall was silent. "I have spent 11 years selling food to people who were desperate. I have charged them more than the food was worth because I could, and because the system allowed it, and because no one had an alternative. Ragnhild created an alternative. She did not do it to challenge me. She did it because her grandmother taught her something I did not know, and she had the patience and the courage to do it even when every person in this village told her she was wrong." He turned to face Ragnhild, who was sitting on the women's bench with her children on either side of her. "The fish rights I acquired this winter, the pledges, the labor debts, the land deeds, I am returning them, all of them. Every family that traded with me this winter will have their property restored." The hall erupted, not in anger, in something closer to shock. A Jarl giving back what he had legally acquired was almost without precedent. It was an admission of wrongdoing so complete that it changed the meaning of everything Eric had done for the past decade. Ragnhild stood. "I did not do this to shame you, Eric," she said. "I did it because hunger is not a thing to profit from. My grandmother knew that. Her grandmother knew it before her. The technique is not secret. It is not magic. It is patience and trust in a process that works. I will teach it to anyone who wants to learn." The following summer, Ragnhild held the first teaching. She did not announce it formally, did not petition the thing for permission, did not ask Eric's approval. She simply told the women she had fed during the winter that she would be at her farm on the first Saturday of July, and that anyone who wanted to learn should bring a shovel and an empty barrel. 11 families came. 23 people in total, mostly women, but a handful of men too, standing in Ragnhild's yard in the midsummer sun, looking at the fermentation pit that had saved their lives 4 months earlier with the particular reverence that people reserve for things they do not fully understand but know to be important. Ragnhild taught the way her grandmother had taught her. She started with the pit, 4 feet deep minimum, she told them, deeper if the frost line in your area went below 3 feet. The walls had to be lined with flat stones, fitted tight, no gaps larger than a finger's width. Gaps let in groundwater, and groundwater ruined the fermentation. The floor had to be gravel over clay. It sloped slightly toward one corner where a drainage channel could carry off any liquid that accumulated during the first weeks. "The pit is your cellar," she said. "It does the work of a smokehouse and a salt house combined, but it does it slowly. Smoking preserves fish for months. Burying preserves it for years. The earth does not change. The temperature 4 feet down is the same in January as it is in July. That constancy is what makes the fermentation work." She showed them how to build the barrels. Oak was best, she said, because oak was dense and held the pitch seal longest. Birch could work but had to be thicker. Pine was too porous and would leak within 2 months. The staves had to be tight-fitted, the hoops iron rather than rope, the lids flat and heavy and sealed with a double layer of pine pitch mixed with beeswax. She showed them the layering. A layer of coarse sea salt on the bottom, 2 fingers deep. Then a layer of gutted, cleaned cod, packed tight with no air gaps between the fish. Then dried seaweed. Bladder wrack was best, she said, because it released minerals during the fermentation that improved the flavor and the nutrition. Then another layer of salt, then fish, then seaweed, up and up until the barrel was full, with a final thick layer of salt on top and the lid pressed down with a wooden disc weighted with 30 pounds of stone. "The weight is important," she told them. "Without the weight, the fish floats in the liquid as the fermentation begins. Floating fish ferments unevenly. The top rots while the bottom transforms. The weight keeps everything compressed, everything in contact, everything fermenting at the same rate." She answered questions for 3 hours. How much salt per pound of fish? How to tell good fermentation from bad? What to do if a barrel cracked underground? How long to wait before the first taste test? Whether the technique worked with herring as well as cod? Whether it worked with whale meat? Whether children could eat it safely? The answers were patient and specific. 1 pound of salt per 3 pounds of fish. Good fermentation smelled sharp and clean. Bad fermentation smelled sweet and wet. A cracked barrel should be dug up immediately and the fish transferred to a sound barrel within hours. The first taste test should happen at 3 months, but the fish would not reach its best until 5 or 6 months. Herring worked, but fermented faster and had a stronger flavor. Whale meat worked, but needed more salt and deeper burial. Children could eat it from the age of 2, starting with small amounts mixed with grain porridge. By the end of the day, 11 families had marked the spots on their own land where they would dig their pits. Ragnhild promised to visit each one during the digging to check the depth and the stone lining. She kept that promise, walking between farms in the long summer evenings, inspecting the work with the careful eye of someone who understood that a mistake in July meant death in March. The barrels went in the ground in September, filled with the summer's catch. 44 new barrels across 11 farms, plus Ragnhild's own fresh 40. The Vestfjord now had nearly 1,000 pounds of preserved fish underground, distributed across the community and owned by the families who had packed it with their own hands. The next winter, when the stores ran low in March, as they always did, 11 families had their own supply underground. The hungry weeks that had defined Vestfjord life for generations, those desperate weeks when the smokehouse was bare and the salt barrels were empty and the only option was Eirik's storehouse at Eirik's prices, those weeks simply did not happen for 11 families. They went to their pits, opened a barrel, and ate. And the winter after that, 20 families. Word had spread beyond Havenfjord to the settlements up and down the coast, and women from 3 neighboring villages came to Ragnhild's summer teaching. And the winter after that, every family on the Vestfjord. Jarl Eirik's monopoly on surplus was broken, not by force, not by politics, and not by any of the mechanisms that normally shift power from one person to another. It was broken by a woman who buried fish in the ground because her grandmother told her it would work. The phrase Ragnhild's barrels entered the vocabulary of the Vestfjord the way that useful phrases do, gradually and then all at once. When a family dug their fermentation pit, they called it their Ragnhild pit. When the first barrels went in the ground each September, the day was called Burying Day. When the spring came and the barrels were opened and the sharp, pungent smell of successfully fermented fish rose from the earth, people would say, "Ragnhild is cooking," and they would smile, because the smell that had disgusted them once now meant safety and independence and the particular freedom that comes from not needing anything from the man on the hill. Eric himself dug a fermentation pit the following autumn. He did it quietly, without announcement, on the advice of his wife, who had decided that being prepared was more important than being proud. When Ragnhild walked past his farm and saw the fresh-turned earth behind his hall, she said nothing. She did not smile. She did not comment. She just kept walking, because the point had never been about Eric. The point had always been about the fish. Thank you for watching this story about Ragnhild and the 40 barrels of Jarl. If it reminded you of the importance of preparation and the value of knowledge that the powerful dismiss as worthless, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Saga of Survival for more stories of quiet ingenuity and the people who trusted the process. Ragnhild Ketilsdottir lived until the age of 67, dying in the farmhouse that Ketil had built and that she had maintained for 25 years after his death. Her fermentation pit was still operational, the stone lining as solid as the day she had laid it, the earth around it permanently saturated with the particular smell that she had never tried to wash away, because the smell was the preservation, and the preservation was the life. Her eldest son, Torsten, took over the farm and the fermentation pits and the teaching sessions that Ragnhild had held every summer for 20 years. He taught his own children, and they taught theirs, and the techniques spread up the coast and down the coast and across the water to Iceland, where it became the foundation of a food tradition that would endure for 1,000 years. They buried her beside Ketil, near the fjord, in a spot where the fishing boats launched at dawn and the nets dried in the afternoon sun. The earth above her grave smelled faintly of salt and fermentation, and no one who passed by ever mistook it for rot. Her gravestone said only what she had asked it to say. She buried what they mocked. It fed them all. What is the shelter that everyone thinks you do not have? And where have you buried your preparation?